I've used the word medic to cover men who relieve the sick for payment, which obviously ruled out a lot of patients. Every housewife would have some remedies for everyday ailments, and we've heard about some herbal remedies earlier today. But I'm discussing men who had studied their subject and had qualifications, and it really was nearly always men. You can see on the screen the three types of medicine, the three branches of medicine. The doctor of physic, who diagnosed ailments and prescribed remedies, the apothecary, who made up and dispensed those remedies, and the surgeon, who did surgery, basically cut bits off you or sewed you up. Then the surgeons were linked with barbers at first. And you will see the apothecaries is perhaps a slightly odd one today. Nowadays they'd be called pharmacists or chemists. And you can see from their origins that they were very much dealing with spices and herbs, but often things that had come from abroad, not like the homegrown herbs that we heard about in the Anglo-Saxon charm. In practice, although there were these three branches, the situation was very fluid. Apothecaries would naturally know what their drugs did or were supposed to do, and they would prescribe for people who came to their shop. This annoyed the College of Physicians, but in 1704, the apothecaries won a case allowing them to prescribe and dispense. If you've read Jane Austen's Emma, you might remember her hypochondriac father, who had regular cosy chats with his apothecary, the perfect GP who did home visits in practice. The Guildford medics I've come across were mostly described as one or other of the three, but Alexander Hallamby, who was active in the mid-18th century, was a surgeon and apothecary. John Howard, who died in 1755, was a surgeon and man midwife, and William Newland in the late 18th century was an apothecary, surgeon and man midwife, though he seems to have acted as a GP. And I think, I said, there was a great deal of crossover between all of them. They would deal with various complaints. All of the ones I come across were professional men of good standing in the town with a certain amount of wealth. This was invested in property and bank stocks after about 1700. They often seem to have come to Guildford from elsewhere, which isn't surprising if they had had to go to a particular place to learn their trade or profession. They witnessed wills and acted as trustees and played their part in civic and parish duties. They were obviously the sort of decent chaps who people could rely on. I've come across 42 medics, but there were probably more. I can't discuss them all here. I'm not going to, but I want to give an idea of illness and death in the town and describe some of the medics in more detail. My main sources have been parish registers and the online catalogue at the Surrey History Centre. The parish registers sometimes give professions or occupations of men, but not always. And sometimes that's the only indication you have that a man was engaged in medicine. And some of these people, I've only come across one reference to them and don't know any more about them. Obviously, there was no official medical care. The exception was among paupers, where the overseers of the poor of the parish would pay for medical help. For example, in 1700, the Holy Trinity overseers of the poor accounts show something of what they were doing. They paid the large sum of £5 12 shillings to the widow Jones for keeping Stephen Weeks for 28 weeks. He was obviously had a long-term illness and she was nursing him. And they also paid a man to help him to and from bed for 15 weeks. And again, the widow Neal was paid for looking after Amos Styles when he was sick of the smallpox. And they also paid Goody Bishop for watching and tending him. So there were two nurses in that case. And perhaps less serious, there was Thomas Brown was paid for curing a girl of the itch. The St Mary's vestry minutes give an idea of how the overseers organised medical help. And could we have the next slide, please? In 1711, they noted a, sorry, it's the one after that. I'm so sorry, I've missed one. They noticed a memorandum that the vestry the day after was going to discuss about Mr. John Howard's demands for the cure of Richard Goodyear's son, in which business he was never employed by the parish officers. So obviously John Howard, who we'll hear about later, had taken it upon himself to cure one of the pauper's sons, and the overseers of the poor were not happy about that. Then in 1719, they made it clear that no doctor, surgeon, or apothecary shall do anything for any of the poor without a note from the church wardens or the overseers. And Holy Trinity had similar rules. In 1784, they made it clear that surgeons and apothecaries had to give in their bills to the quarterly meetings of the vestry, which was the sort of body that ran the church. A couple of years later, they decided that Mrs. Etherington's boy would be examined by the surgeon respecting his lameness, and afterwards sent to the hospital if the surgeon thinks it necessary. That's actually very interesting because there was no hospital in Guildford, so I imagine he was sent up to a London hospital. Also, that same year, they wanted Mr. Shaw, who was almost certainly one of the apothecaries, to inspect the state of the sick in the workhouse. So you can see there's the sort of crossover between general medicine and the particular profession of these men. 1788, a boy called Salter was bitten by a mad dog, and it was agreed that he and his widowed mother should be sent to the seaside. Again, interesting that they're sending somebody away. They presumably would have found lodgings for them at the seaside, unless there were one or two hospitals by the sea at this point, so it may have been one of those. A few more details. In 1791, William Worsfold was to be bled by the doctor. Anne Parkhurst was to attend a woman during her lying in. It's presumably she was a midwife, but it doesn't actually say that. 1793, there was a meeting about inoculation. And could we have the next slide, please? Various poor people were to be inoculated at the parish's expense, and 21 names were given. This is the end of the document, and if you look very closely, you'll see the word inoculation, but mostly these signatures are of the parishioners at the vestry who had made the decision about it. In 1762, that's nearly 30 years earlier, both Holy Trinity and St Mary's parishes agreed to rent a house at Trunley Heath in sort of Shalford to send poor people with smallpox to quarantine there. If you know Guildford, you probably know Holy Trinity and St Mary's churches. They're the two churches which more or less divide the two parishes that divide the town in half, with St Nicholas on the other side of the river. So with some things like poor relief and health, they got together and did things together, which was obviously more convenient. Earlier in the 18th century, William Bray, the famous historian of Surrey, who was training to be a lawyer in Guildford, and his master's son and one of the maids were inoculated in 1756. Jackie, the boy, was affected 6 days later and stayed in his room for a week. Bray had a slight fever 2 days later and then was blind for 4 days. But 2 weeks later, he and Jackie were well enough to be taken out for an airing around the racecourse at Merrow. He doesn't say any more about the maid, unfortunately. I've just seen that question and I don't know which type it is, I'm afraid. I think it's probably the earlier sort where you actually were injected with smallpox rather than cowpox. Next slide, please. Obviously, we get very little information about what was wrong with people and how they were treated. So a diary like William Bray's is invaluable. And there's one other diary, not strictly speaking Guildford, but it's Elizabeth Davis of Gosden House at Bramley in the 1790s. And so that gives us an idea of what ailments the doctors treated. In case you wonder what you're looking at, in the sort of middle of the second column, there was a list of patent medicines which were sold by Parvish and Russell, who were booksellers and cutlers. And if you're able to see, they sold an extraordinary range of items, including these patent medicines. So Elizabeth Davis's diary tells us that in 1793, Mr. Smith saw her nephew about a sore throat, and he was probably Dr. William Smith of Guildford, who also attended her sister who lived in Cobham. So they clearly were prepared to travel. In 1794, Dr. Smith came when a maid was scalded, and in 1795, when another maid cut her arm badly and Mr. Smith sewed it up. Caleb Woodyer also treated the Davis family. Actually, they were the Sparks family. He'd been apprenticed to William Newland, who was described as a surgeon, apothecary, and man midwife in 1781. In 1798, Woodyer treated one of the family who'd injured a knee falling from a horse, and Newland prescribed bathing it with bitter herbs. And he also treated Elizabeth for toothache. In 1799, Robert, the shepherd of the family, was very ill, and Elizabeth called in Mr. Newland and found a nurse for the shepherd. The family were all uneasy about him, and Mr. Sparks, who owned Gosden House, went to see Mr. Newland about him the next day, which is an interesting indication of the sort of care that a family could give to their employees. So the family had used 3 medics in the 7 years of the diary, but it's impossible to say why they chose them. They're sort of general problems, sort of fairly bad things that you couldn't deal with yourself, obviously. But why those precise doctors were chosen, we simply can't say. At least one Guildford woman was a hypochondriac. John Shotter made his will in 1761 and included the very unusual bequest to his loving wife, Elizabeth. She was to have as much money as she thought fit to expend for herself with doctors, surgeons, apothecaries, nurses, and tenders, not exceeding £10 in any 1 year. She lived until 1788, dying at the age of 83. So obviously, these people had done her a lot of good. Next slide, please. Abbott's Hospital is another instance of institutional care. It was founded as an almshouse in 1619, by George Abbott, and he wrote very careful rules for it, including one on looking after the sick. He said rather touchingly, "It cannot be conceived, but where aged people are, some are like divers times to be sick, who are then to be attended and comforted. For in health, each one can take care of himself, but in sickness, he must be helped by others. So I appoint first that all the sisters," this is the women who lived in the house, "shall from time to time be careful over the sick, as themselves would wish to be helped, where they are to remember that as natural sisters are loving to their brothers and sisters, so I would have these be kind to each other, whom I, as a common father, have incorporated into this society." So interesting view of how people saw their responsibilities to the sick. He then went on to say that the master should choose 2 women each year to be relievers of the impotent and paid 6 and 8 for their year. There's very little about medical care in the hospital ledger, though in 1713, Thomas Terry broke George Heath's head in a drunken quarrel and had to pay the surgeon, as well as losing a month's pay. We almost never know why people died, but parish registers show how fragile life could be. There are plenty of burials of stillborn babies or babies who had died very young, and often the mother was buried about the same time. There were 2 sad cases of abandoned children being buried. In 1697, in Holy Trinity, when a newborn child was found on someone's wall, and in Stoke in 1770, when a child called Thomas was found in a stable and buried on Christmas Day. From 1758 to 1760, each year in the town, several babies from the Foundling Hospital in London, who had been sent to wet nurses in Guildford, died. This was because in those years, the authorities had accepted every baby without checking its health, and inevitably many of them died. After that, they were a bit more choosy and did not accept those who are very likely to die. Sudden death was a hazard for adults. In 1634, Thomas Smith from Compton died suddenly at the quarter sessions in Guildford and was buried in Holy Trinity, though you might think he could have been taken back to Compton. St Nicholas parish over the river in Guildford seems to have had more than their share of these sudden deaths. Next, oh, thank you. In 1687, a certain soldier died who was so ill he couldn't tell them his name. Several of these people were travellers. There was one in 1739 called Margaret, an unknown person in 1741, a stranger who died at the Chequer Inn, whose name was not known, and a woman simply found dead, and no one knew her name. People occasionally drowned, such as Henry, the son of Thomas Adey, who was buried in Holy Trinity in 1668, and Agnes Heath, a servant of St Mary's parish, who drowned in 1635. In 1768, Mr. John King from London was accidentally drowned in this river and buried in St Nicholas. That sounds slightly odd. I mean, you don't presumably very much often purposely drown somebody. The fact he's called Mr. John King suggests he was fairly wealthy. Perhaps he'd come down with a party to go fishing on the river or something and drowned. We don't know, only the fact that he was drowned. There was a lot of detail in the parish register for Stoke, which is just outside Guildford. And in fact, the High Street extended into Stoke parish. So sometimes people living in Stoke were actually much closer to Guildford than the little settlement of Stoke around the church. But the parish register describes an accident in 1748, which obviously shocked people because the clerk went into quite a lot of detail. He said, Amos Tucker and Anne Ledier both drowned by accident below Stoke Lock. They were lovers. The young woman fell in, and her lover, endeavouring to get her out, fell in also, and both were drowned together. Then in 1792, William Punter and his daughter Jane from Stoke Lock also drowned. Some drownings may have been suicide, but this is never mentioned in the records, either because they were clearly accidents or there was no proof of it. There are only 3 known suicides in the registers. In 1627, Anne Tisbury poisoned herself and was buried in dishonour at St Mary's. She would have been buried in the churchyard. Earlier suicides were supposed to be buried outside of churchyards, but by this time the rule had been relaxed, but there wouldn't be a funeral service for them. And in 1722, Alderman Lawrence Lidger cut his own throat and was also buried in dishonour without funeral service. And in 1692, Sarah Chalcraft of Stoke poisoned herself with ratsbane, which is arsenic. And these are obviously very shocking occurrences for the time. And we know of a couple of accidents. In 1601, Daniel Chandler and Daniel Wheel, who were both weavers, were killed with gunpowder while training on Merrow Down and were buried at St Mary's. They would be training for the militia, or the sort of amateur soldiers who had to be trained in case of invasion. And in 1789, Maurice Goggin, a sailor, was accidentally killed by falling under the wheel of a wagon in St Nicholas parish. It's likely that a doctor or surgeon was called out to most of these incidents, but normally, of course, they would attend people in their homes, though we have very little information about this. In one rare instance, in 1753, Alexander Hallamby, surgeon and apothecary, described a deathbed scene. He had to do this because there was an irregularity about the will. He had been sent a message to bring Mr. James Shrub, a lawyer, to make a will for Truth Stevens of Shalford. Interesting name, possibly a Quaker. They arrived at 6 p.m. and found the man very ill. By 8 p.m. he was delirious and was dead by 2 p.m. the next day, as witnessed by his nurse, Elizabeth Rogers of Abinger. Seems a long way to come for a nurse, but perhaps she was especially well qualified or well thought of. Wills were usually made on the deathbed, and Mr. Shrub drafted the will, but because there weren't any witnesses, the doctor and the nurse had to explain these circumstances formally so that probate could be obtained. Wills usually began with a declaration that the testator was either in good health or was not, but was of sound mind. But the illness is never mentioned, except for 2 cases of smallpox in the wills I've come across, one in 1702 and the other in 1712. The only other named cause of death was plague. There were serious outbreaks in Guildford in 1593, 1603 and 1644. The cause isn't always mentioned in the burial register, but the large number of deaths make it obvious what was happening. In 1644, all of the deaths in Holy Trinity Parish seem to have been of pestilence, as they called it, and the clerk listed them by house: 4 from Barnaby Hatches, 6 from George Garman's, 2 from the Half Moon, 6 from the Lion, and so on. 1644 seems to have been a particularly bad year. In the records of George Abbott's manufactory, £50 was paid out to the poor because of the pestilence. Next slide, please. And we'll now look at the medics themselves. The earliest reference is to Thomas Bentley of Guildford, a surgeon, who, with John Tyndale of Petworth, another surgeon, deposed that they had seen and treated the wounds of John Baker and that they would heal fully. This was done for William Moore of Loseley in the later 16th century. Presumably, John Baker had been attacked by somebody, and William Moore, as JP, was looking into the case and needed to know whether the man would die or not. Also in the Loseley manuscripts is a rare account of treatment, though it may not be by a Guildford doctor. In 1599, Sir Thomas Egerton in London wrote to his wife Elizabeth at their house in Pyrford about her father, Sir William Moore. Egerton thought that Moore should not be given too much medicine, but rather given cordial and comfortable things. We don't know whether Moore was at Loseley and Egerton was relaying something he'd heard about in a letter, or if he was in London, but he did die the next year. There were only two known barber surgeons, as you can see on the slide. Horner was elected Master of Abbott's Hospital in 1644, which gives us an idea of his status, because the master had to run the hospital, which contained people of the merchant class who had fallen on hard times. It wasn't a place for paupers, because there was another home for them. So he needed to be an experienced professional who could deal with other people and deal with the finances of the hospital. Almost nothing is known about John Staples, I'm afraid. Next slide, please. I haven't gone into training, but doctors would normally have a degree, and surgeons and apothecaries were apprenticed. Alexander Hallamby, who we've heard about before, may have been born in Tunbridge, and he was active in Guildford from the 1740s to the 1760s, and these are three of his apprentices. And Caleb Woodyer, who we've also heard about, was the son of a brazier from Petworth, and he was apprenticed to William Newland, a surgeon of Guildford, in 1781 for 6 years. Next slide, please. Swithin AD shows how well a doctor could do. This list is in alphabetical order. I tried doing it chronologically, but because some people are only referred to once, it's extremely difficult to do that. So there they are. Swithin AD was born in Devizes in 1704 and married Olive Child of a wealthy Guildford family, and through her he inherited land in Effingham. Their first child was born in London in 1732, and the four others in Guildford. William Bray was a friend of the daughters in the 1750s, and one of them was his wife's bridesmaid. And Bray visited them when he was living in London, where their father had a house in Great Russell Street. By 1772, AD was living in Oxford. So Dr. AD shows, I think, how wealthy and well-connected doctors could be. Another doctor, Robert Mitchell, came from Dumfries in Scotland and was in Guildford before 1731. When Elizabeth Coe, who was the widow of another doctor, mentioned in her will that there was a previous will in the hands of Dr. Mitchell, so he may have been her own physician by then, or obviously somebody you could trust with that sort of thing. He lived at 49 Quarry Street, and he lengthened his garden into the castle grounds around the keep. So 49 Quarry Street is next door to the museum. So what we're looking at here has the bottom of the mound or motte on your right, and on the left is the garden gates onto the Quarry Street garden. In 1759, William Bray and his wife walked in the garden with Dr. Mitchell and his wife, and Boy's employer, the lawyer John Martyr, and his wife were friendly with the Mitchells and dined there, drank tea there. Next slide, please. The property was sold in Dr. Mitchell's will, shows that he was quite wealthy. He owned land in Norfolk, and his will mentions jewels, silver plate, books, carriages and horses, and 2 sets of portraits of himself and his first wife. And he left £200 to build an infirmary for the poor of Dumfries, his hometown. There were 2 other doctors linked with the castle, Dr. Winderbank, who was active in the 1650s and leased the castle estate, and Dr. Thomas Remington, who lived in Castle Arch and came to Guildford in the 1790s. He was clearly an amateur artist, and in his will, he left his paints and pictures to his daughter Sarah, who had married James Stedman, who was another Guildford doctor, and that is his painting of the bowling green, which is the only one known of because it's in the museum collection. And it's particularly useful, of course, as a bit of local history, showing what the bowling green, which is still on the site, looked like at that date. Another interesting doctor is William Rosewell, who died in 1691. He described himself as a doctor in physic, but he left his son Edward all the medicine in the shop, and stills and alembics and other instruments, which sound like an apothecary's equipment. Also a box of surgeon's instruments and a silver syringe and a cornelian ring with the arms of the apothecary's company. So he seems to have practiced all the 3 branches of medicine. Surgeons could also be men of property. Could we have the next slide, please? Richard Huggett inherited the Tun Inn from his father in 1719, which would have made him a good income because it was opposite the Guildhall and had the corn market in front of it. And John Cunningham owned the Ship Inn next to Holy Trinity Church, because at this point, buying property, investing in property was one of the few ways that you could make your money work for you. There were 2 surgeons called Hallamby. We've heard about Alexander, and Richard was probably his brother. We don't know much about him, but he was wealthy enough to have left £500 to his servant girl Fanny. There were 2 surgeons called Howard, who were definitely brothers, active in the early 18th century. Could I have the next slide, please? This will show us the map of Guildford in 1739, and just above where Chertsey Street meets High Street is Mr. Howard's house. So he was clearly well known enough to have his house pointed out on this map. He left his son, Abraham, all his books, surgical instruments and other things in my shop and surgery, and various other things which indicate he was quite well off. My large silver ring, my silver hilted sword, hanger and pistols, and the horses or horse I shall have at the time of my decease. He became infamous for the case of the Rabbit Woman of Godalming in 1726. And I really don't understand why he was taken in by it, because he was a surgeon and a man midwife who'd been practicing for over 30 years. I can only assume he maybe hoped to make money out of it, which was presumably why the Rabbit Woman did it. There's less known about apothecaries. John Harraden was apprenticed to his father Richard in 1717, but his father died the next year, and his mother continued the training, which is interesting. A later apothecary is Mr. Cunningham, who is probably mentioned by James Price, the so-called alchemist, who in 1782 claimed to turn mercury into gold and silver. He wrote a pamphlet about it, going into great detail, apparently proving that there could be no trickery in it. And he mentions that he'd used half an ounce of mercury procured from one Mr. Cunningham, an apothecary of the town. So it gives us an idea of the sort of things they sold, sort of chemicals as well as spices and so on.
Mary, your time is nearly up. Are you nearly finished?
I have nearly finished, yes. Could I have the next slide, please? This will show you a tomb. Oh, no, it won't. It will show you John Howard, because that's a print by Hogarth. John Howard is standing in the doorway, supposedly buying rabbits for this trick. I'm looking for a tomb. The next slide. Oh, I think we're going backwards. That's it. The Shaw family are interesting because they produced a dynasty of apothecaries over at least 5 generations. The first one is mentioned in 1599, and the last one died in 1828. This is the family tomb. You can't actually read the name Shaw on it, but it was first established actually in 1562. But the last of the Shaws rebuilt it in 1824. And sadly, in the 1980s, it was lowered for safety reasons. So it looks a bit odd there. But they are a very unusual dynasty, as I said, of apothecaries. And their wills, again, show that they were really quite well off. Sadly, William, who, well, 4 of them were called William, one was called Samuel. The last William didn't marry or have children, so he was the end of the line. And the next slide, I will finish. This is David Irish, a physician and surgeon. He wrote this book on astrology, which isn't really the one I want to show you, but I haven't got a picture of the one who did, which was about his medical practice. He lived in probably in Leapell Lane in Guildford, beyond North Street. And he also looked after the mentally ill, which is fairly rare at this time. But he seems to have been a very sympathetic person, and had his own private madhouse, as they were called at the time. So he was working from at least about 1700. So I hope this has given you an idea of the medical conditions suffered by people in Guildford and the men who treated them. Thank you.